I want to do a Chronicon presentation, but I want to focus on a very small window of history that literally changed the world into what it is today. And this series of events that we're going to discuss right here is just a small window that began in 63 AD. And from 63 AD to 135 AD, this series of events is going to explain to you now not only the world that we live in today, but why it is this way, who the major players are, what is really going on. So this basically involves one of the greatest psyops in history, and people don't want to come to terms with this. They have their hard time wrapping their mind around what Rome did when they took the Mithraic faith. They took the Mithraic faith of a savior with 12 disciples who came to take away the sins of the world, which is the principal tenet of the ancient religion of Mithraism. And they turned around and created this Christian doctrine and basically narrated these gospels and took these materials out of a stage play, the Gospel of Marcion, called the Sayings of Jesus. But before we even get into that, you've got to understand the role the Jews played in all of this, because it's integral to understanding what's going on in our world today. I have from 1803, and I have another edition from the 1880s, but I have the complete works of Josephus. Yes, guys, I have very old ones from 1803, and then I have some from the 1880s. They are unchanged. They are not manipulated. Me and another guy sat down because he was really curious about if there was any changes, in the Josephus deal. So he and I sat down at the table with Carol in Arkansas when I was traveling, and we pulled out my newest purchases on Josephus, and we compared the versions. There's no changes. Josephus remains unchanged, at least from 1803 to the 1880s, and from the 1880 editions to the modern ones that you can buy on Amazon right now. There are no changes. We looked up so many different passages. There's just no changes. So what we find is something very unusual. Now, Christian proponents do not cite this passage in Josephus for obvious reasons, but they should. They should. Josephus in Annals of Annals of the World 63. Josephus is very clear about a story. He doesn't mention Christianity, Christians, any of that. He says that 7 years before the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, a man appeared and began prophesying against Jerusalem, saying, woe, woe, woe unto Jerusalem, and giving all kinds of moral and ethical and prophetic reasons why Jerusalem was about to be destroyed. He did this 7 years before the Romans destroyed Jerusalem in AD 70. He started his prophesying in 63 AD. This man drew the attention of the common people, and they flocked to him, and they believed he was a prophet of God. It got to the attention of the Jewish nobility, and they had him arrested, and they had him publicly flogged. But he wouldn't stop. He wouldn't shut up. He continued his preaching. The common people healed him, protected him, and then turned around, and he just did it again. And he prophesied over and over. He was becoming a real thorn in the side of the Jewish nobility and the priesthood. So this is the 7 years leading up to the complete destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. Now, it is said by it is said by Flavius Josephus that it was notable to the people that when he was being flogged, which other men scream, but he was being flogged, and he showed no signs of pain. He just stood there and took it. And he continued to prophesy against Jerusalem. He survived. He survived all the deals. And Josephus moves on like he does in so many other narratives, and it no longer goes back to that or pays any more attention to it. It's just a small deal. Now, other people have come forward in their research, and they believe that this little incident is part of the construction of the Jesus story. It's one element that was used in the introduction where this story was merged with the story of Apollonius of Tyana, who was born in 2 BC and was a miracle worker and was also a prophet, and was also venerated by the people and considered to be very wise. And that this story was married to that. And these stories were married to the most popular religion existing at the time, which was Mithraism. The Mithraic faith was in competition with Buddhism in the 1st century AD. This is what was going on at the time. And in the Mithraic faith, Mithra was a savior with 12 disciples who preached salvation and resurrection. These elements, all going on in the 1st century AD, are very widely attested in the historical record. The story of Jesus and his 12 disciples being a miracle worker, born of a virgin, none of this is found in any 1st century writings. These are all found ex post facto. These are all found, as we'll get to here in a little while. But all the writings we have from the 1st century AD, none of the gospel record finds anything to comport with it. The sun darkening, an earthquake, crucifixion event, none of these things are found in Tacitus and Tatian and Seneca and Pliny the Younger and Pliny the Elder, in the Plotinus and many other 1st century authors that for which we have their writings today. They don't verify these things. But we do have a 1st century author right here, Josephus, who does mention this. He doesn't call him Jesus, doesn't call him a Christian, but the story sure looks real similar. So, moving on, we're going to start. This was 7 years before 70 AD, but this dissertation really begins in 66 AD. 66 AD. First of all, 66 years is 792 months. For those of you who have really gone deep into Chronicon, like I know Clay has, and I know Shiva Shampoo has, Jahara has. I know there's a few of you in here. I recognize your name. Maybe Clay's Pigeon. Some of you guys that have gone really deep into the chronography, you understand 792 is a very evil number. It is attached to wickedness. It is attached to the freedom of individuals in escaping a wicked world. It is a number that is specifically related to the Nemesis X object, 792. Now, we have here 66 Anno Domini. 66 years is 792 months. This is when the Jews unified and basically rebelled against Rome. This was a huge deal because it sent shockwaves through the entire Roman provincial Mediterranean world. And the Jews were not prepared at this time for the series of events that was about to unfold. Now, to give you a little context, what was going on in that period of the world at this time was the Roman world was waking up. And I'm going to cite a couple of these historians that were alive during that time and what they said. But the Roman world was waking up that their wealth was being siphoned away. And they blamed the Jewish culture. They blamed the Jews for manipulating their financial institutions and doing all kinds of things that were weakening the economy of Rome. The Roman Senate took it seriously, and they traced the problem to Jerusalem. So, let's see. I want to make sure that we get this right. I pulled all these pages out of Chronicon because I wanted to make sure we don't miss anything in this dissertation here. So, 66 AD was the 13th year of Nero. You guys have heard of Nero, wicked SOB, basically a sociopathic emperor. But Nero, in the 13th year of Nero, a major earthquake struck Knossos and pushed open a tomb wherein people found a box containing ancient tablets covered in writings that couldn't be read. I don't know if we have those tablets today, if they've ended up in somebody else's private collection, because in the historical record, it specifically mentioned that Nero received those as a present, but we don't know whatever happened to them. Ancient tablets that were found in the Palace of Knossos. Now remember, Palace of Knossos was destroyed in 1447 BC. When major earthquakes in the doom shape appeared in the sky, the angel of death appeared over Egypt, and the Israelites in the Danoi, the ancient Greeks, escaped, and the Egyptians suffered basically a reset. That was 1447 BC. 1447 BC, guys, is 792 years after the Great Flood reset, the collapse of the vapor canopy. Remember, you're gonna hear me say the number 792 multiple times in this dissertation because it's relevant here. All this chronology, all these dates line up to in multiples of 792. This is an excellent way to establish the veracity of the timing of certain events. They will always line up chronographically with their subject matter. So here we have 66 AD. Let's see, a comet appears in the sky. The Jews are in full rebellion against taxation by Rome. Let's see what else happened. And in this year, according to Flavius Josephus, the Jewish war against Rome begins, 66 AD. Remember, the Jewish War is a very huge book written by Flavius Josephus. It is packed with a lot of information. But the Jews started riots, and in those riots, Roman legionnaires went in to break up all the controversy and all that, but it was a trap. The Jews had set several traps, and when the legions had come into the city and they were separated by the press of people and separated throughout all the streets, they were vulnerable. Then came out the soldiers of the Jews in Jerusalem, and they butchered the Roman legion, which was the stupidest thing they could have ever done. So the Jews did not have a very good grasp about what they were really up against. So it's very interesting that this great war against the Jews against Rome would start in 66 AD. Let's look. If some of you got your Chronicon out, you're going to be really astonished to see the calendrics, because this is 3960 Annus Mundi. This is 3,960 years from my phone from the Adam and Eve reset of 3895 BC, the great pole shift that started the pre-flood world, the vapor canopy, the 1656 years of the antediluvian period in Genesis was started in that year. Therefore, the Jewish war against Rome was 3,960 years. Let me show you what this is in the calendrics, because I didn't date that. The historical record in thousands of books dates the Jewish war. 3960 divided by 5 is 792. Again, we have our Nemesis X number, this evil number that involves both punishment for those who stay behind and exodus for those who don't. Here it is again, 792. So the calendrics confirm this. This is AD 66. This is the 792 months into the Anno Domini calendar, but it's 792 times 5 since the Adam and Eve reset, since the beginning of the Annus Mundi calendar. It's connected to the Exodus. We have a connection in this year to the destruction of Knossos and the burying of these tablets in the middle of the Mediterranean. It happened in 1447 BC. I didn't date that. I've already showed you guys in multiple presentations all the different cryptologists and chronologists that date the Exodus event in 1447, which was 792 years after the Great Flood, the day the sky fell. So let's look at this again, and in the Calendrics we find something else interesting. This was 3,168 years into the Vedic chronology, the ancient Vedic of India timekeeping system. So, if my memory serves correctly, 3168 divided by 792 is 4. So here we have 792 times 4 since the beginning of the Kali Yuga system. Yes, here's the dark calendar. I find that pretty interesting. So the calendars also show something interesting about Anno Pyramid. This is exactly 2,880 years after the Great Pyramid was completed. Anno Pyramid. While this is not divisible by 792, what is interesting is that 2880 is a Fibonacci number. It is a golden proportion number divisible by 144. So many events throughout the Old Testament, as those of you who have read and studied my Chronicon will know, events involving the ancient Israelites are always 144 years after or before another major event involving the ancient Israelites. It's like the entire history of the world is coded in Fibonacci programming. So I think that pretty much does away with the Black Age of Kali Yuga. This is the fourth period of the Black Age, each one being 792 years long. Let's see. All right, so in this year, as an aside, 66 AD, the Jews rebel against Rome and butcher a Roman legion in Jerusalem. The Romans are already pissed. They're already getting fed up with basically Jewish affairs in all the different provinces. The Senate has been hearing complaints from all over the empire of all kinds of financial malpractices. And in this year also, in a fit of rage, Nero kicked his pregnant wife. She is Jewish. Her name is Poppaea. She was rumored to be very, very beautiful, a Jewish woman who was married to Nero. And while all these problems are going on, when she's pregnant, Nero stomps Poppaea to death. So historians claim that her pregnancy was advanced at this time. Now, also, you also have to consider that histories have been redacted, and the reasons why he stomped his Jewish wife would probably be swept under the rug and not really given. Later historians would find it a sensitive matter to give out the details, so they would just report the act. So there was a lot of tension between Romans and Jews at this time. A lot. Now, I will say this. Many of the publishing companies after the Renaissance period all the way till today, since Gutenberg, he didn't invent it, he stole it from Coster of Haarlem. But since Gutenberg popularized the printing press and began manufacturing them and selling them all over the place, since those days, it's been Jewish publishers that have been largely in control of the direction of historical narratives and stuff, and they've been very clever at the ways they do it. So many of these things that we read, a lot of the guilt of one party would be washed over. You wouldn't get a real clear picture without seeing all the different angles. So that's the problem. That's the problem when only one culture owns a huge significant portion, the majority of the publishing industry. All right, so it is at this time during all this controversy that we have so many different references, and I'm not going to name them all. There's a bunch of them in Chronicon, but we have enough just to satisfy your curiosity here. I'll read this one right here. Seneca. In Seneca's writings that we have surviving today, Seneca referred to the Jews as the most criminal of all nations. Remember, guys, this is 2,000 years ago. So, again, the 1st century AD, when all these events are unfolding, Tacitus left us a record. Tacitus wrote about the Jews, and he said, among themselves, they are inflexibly honest and ever ready to show compassion, though they regard the rest of humanity with the hatred of all enemies. That's a pretty powerful statement, and it's equally true today as it was 2,000 years ago. Yeah, there's a few more of those statements. We're not gonna go into, because I will be clear. I will be clear. There's a lot of good Jewish people that are not involved in all this at all. But 100% I'm on board. I even have some Jewish friends. Listen, it's not about bashing an entire culture or even a race. It's all about getting down to the business of understanding why our world is so chaotic today. There's a definitive reason. It started back then. Oh. All right, let's go with. So here's the irony of the situation. In 67 AD, it's none other than Flavius Josephus who leads the Jewish army against Rome, the one that left us all these historical records. So, but he's largely unsuccessful. His own army is defeated by Vespasian. It's a place called Judea. Now, Josephus, the Jewish historian, is taken prisoner, and this is when he adopted the Flavian name. Flavius was not his original name. So, let's see. He wrote Antiquities of the Jews, he wrote Jewish War, and he wrote the book Against Apion. I've read all three of them. Complete works of Josephus are huge, probably about this big altogether. They're huge. Great windows into the ancient world, and yes, I'm pretty sure that some of it has been redacted over time. I'm pretty sure it has. So that's in 67. That's in 67. The Jewish war against Rome continues. The defeat of Josephus does not end the rebellion. And the Romans have other problems in other provinces, like in Germany and even in Rome itself, to where they can't really deal with these issues. So we have 68 AD. 68 AD comes around, and something very unusual near Rome happens, recorded by Pliny the Elder in natural history. An entire Roman estate corkscrewed, and it stayed that way. The manor, the outbuildings, all the pasture land, it raised up, twisted 180 degrees, and then lowered back down, as if there's giant machines underground that can move. It's so, even to Pliny, it was so unusual. But it was widely attested, and he recorded it in his book, Pliny the Elder. I'm not even going to try and pretend to explain that phenomenon. We're not talking about a cataclysm or a destruction at all. We are talking about an upheaval of land that is lifted, a whole estate that belonged to somebody, and turned around in a 360 and then lowered back down, and that's where it stayed. That is just absolutely bizarre. But so many things that Pliny the Elder has said has been confirmed in the historical record and confirmed in other writings that we have no reason to doubt. We have no reason to think that he would risk impugning the credibility of his other statements by making up such a story. Let's see. Death. Okay, Seneca. But check this out. Remember, Seneca was a real critic of the Jewish people. And at this time in 68, during the Jewish war against Rome, at this time, accusations are laid upon Seneca and a conspiracy is hatched. Seneca is found guilty and made to be an enemy of the public. So he is let's see. Oh, excuse me. I'm sorry. Seneca accuses Nero of being an enemy of the state and an enemy of the public, and Seneca and others rise up and declare that Nero should die a slave's death. I'm sorry, I had that backwards. Yeah, I'm sorry, that was totally backwards because it was Galba. Galba is elected emperor, and Nero flees Rome, committing suicide. But Nero was condemned to die, to be whipped until he was dead before the people. That never happened because he escaped and committed suicide. The Jewish war is on hold while the entire city of Rome is in uproar with auctions as all of Nero's possessions are spread out. All the things Nero had stolen from different people. This is right after he stomped Poppaea, his wife, to death. So remember, Josephus is defeated by Vespasian out there in the field, legionnaire general. And the Roman general Vespasian in 69 AD travels to none other than Mount Carmel in ancient Israel. Sacrifices on the altar there, on an altar that Tacitus, Roman historian, said was quite ancient. This is in Lower Syria, a famous site in the Old Testament narratives. So a local priest in that area of ancient Israel tells Vespasian that he is destined for greatness, and that local astrologers confirm this because of the appearance of a comet and other strange bodies in the sky. And it is later in this same year that Vespasian, who defeated Josephus, becomes the emperor of Rome. As soon as he becomes emperor of Rome, the tide of war between the Jews takes a dark turn. The Jews were largely successful in holding off the Romans from total occupation and conquering them. But now Vespasian takes the throne and orders through the Senate, he orders his own son Titus to destroy Jerusalem in the Jewish war. This is in the Histories, Book 2, written by Tacitus. Well, I have a note for 69 AD that I don't want to miss because I'm not really sure what it says. 69 AD note. Oh, okay. Well, Tacitus mentions the star, the comet in the sky. Well, I have an archaeological note right here. The Han Shu text of ancient China reports the appearance of a guest star in the month of July for the same year. This is recorded in the book Wonders in the Sky on page 384. So that's a really neat correlate right there, that Tacitus's description of what's going on is also comported right here with a Chinese text. That's pretty interesting. So 70 AD. So remember, it's at this time that 70 AD that Josephus declares at the end of the Jewish war, when right before Jerusalem is destroyed, Josephus also mentions that a star resembling a sword appeared in the sky. So here's a third reference to this object appearing in the sky right before Jerusalem is destroyed. And remember, for 7 years, this guy has been upsetting the Jewish nobility and the Jewish priests, but he's a hero to the people. And all he says for 7 years is, woe, woe, woe unto Jerusalem. It's about to fall. It's about to be destroyed. He's been preaching for 7 years, and now the time has come. What's really interesting about the calendrics here is 70 AD. 70 AD, guys, is the 1000th year perfectly of the divided kingdom calendar. For those of you who have read my Chronicon, you'll know the divided kingdom began in 931 BC. It is when the 10 tribes of Israel divorced Judah and decided, Judah and Benjamin, we don't want anything to do with you. There was a total rift in the kingdom. There were different cultures from the beginning. They weren't unified. And for those who don't know, you can do your own homework. Within my Dark Scriptures playlist, I show this, and it's easy to find that the first 4 conflicts the Jews entered into after they were divorced from Israel was against Israel itself. A lot of people think that the Israelites and the Jews are the same people coming from the same stock. They are not at all. They didn't even have the same religion. The Yahwist religion was never Israelite. Israelite worshiped Balaam and the groves. They venerated Ashtaroth. And they had temples at Ashtaroth, Karnaim, and the holy city of the ancient world was Israelite, and it was called Kadesh, and it's mentioned in many different cuneiform texts for different cultures. The people of Judah, the Judeans, were of Edomite and the stock of Amalek. These people were culturally and racially different with a totally different religion. It's the closest identifying religion in modern history to the ancient Israelite faith is the Celtic worship of Cernunnos. Is the Celtic Druid. It's basically the older oak faith, the Druidic faith that the later Celts adopted. So it's very huge, totally different peoples. This is why all throughout the Old Testament, the Israelites built groves. They venerated. They thought God, the greatest expression of God, came through the tree. This is why the ancient Israelite counting system of jubilees was related to the oak. The oak in ancient was AK, and the oak is very interesting. It's a very interesting tree because only once it's 50 years old does it begin to germinate. Acorns. The oak was the sacred tree of the Druids. It was the sacred tree of the ancient Celts. It was the exact same people separated by a couple thousand years. The people of Judah didn't adopt that system at all until after the Assyrians took the Israelites into captivity. And the Gomorrah in the house Omri, which is called Bit Umri were the Israelites. Bit Umri is mentioned in cuneiform texts. The term Israelite was made up by Jewish scribes in the Old Testament. It's not found anywhere in the historical record. No text, no ancient authors, no monuments, nothing mentions Israelites, because it's an invented word of Jewish scribes that wrote the Old Testament after the people of Bit Umri, which later became in Babylon were called Gomorrah, and which in Assyria became Chimeri and Cimmerian. You know them as Cimmerians. Cimmerian. And they're also called the Simri and the Gimri and the Gauls, and they moved across northern Mediterranean, southern Europe, and they founded Macedonia and there's so many of them. Ancient Lydia. Ancient Phrygia. These people moved all this massive wave of people, and they ended up at the Caucasus, and they passed through the Caucasus and became whoever they are today. So, but that's a subject matter for an entire different story. Even Jewish historians in the 50s, 60s, and 70s have widely published that the 10 tribes of Israel are still alive today, and though they have turned into great nations and empires. So we'll get to that later in another Chronicon episode. But for here, we're at 70 AD and the Jews get crushed. They get crushed by Titus, who brings in the giants. And when I mean giants, he brings in the dreaded 10th Legion of Rome. Yes, after the Romans subdued the Germans and the Burgundians, because the average Roman legionnaire was 5'2". They were fighting men who were 6 foot and 6'8" on the German front, Teutoburg Forest and places like that. And the Burgundians, some of them were 7 foot tall. So the Romans considered the Germans to be the greatest and biggest warriors. So once the Germans were trained how to fight like legionnaires, the actual Roman Latin legionnaires couldn't even oppose them, because of their brute size. Once they learned the Roman legionnaire tactics of fighting in the phalanx system, warfare, it was over with. They became the greatest war engine of Rome. So the Romans under Titus sent for the 10th Legion, which was in Germany, and they came down and totally defeated and razed Jerusalem. And what happened to the Jews in Jerusalem in AD 70 has a lot to do with the world today. Why it is today. Okay, we have some interesting information coming out of AD 70. I'm going to read this because I don't want to get any of this wrong. So, the hostility of the Jews alarmed the Romans, and the political ramifications of this war were far-reaching, for a victory by such an insignificant nation would quickly initiate revolts in other areas. Vespasian, with his 3 legions, had invaded Judea and sieged Jerusalem. But now, in 70 AD, Titus appeared with his 10th legion and broke through the city's walls. Tacitus wrote that Jerusalem was a famous city of antiquity whose people originated in Egypt long ago but had left due to a plague. Tacitus also recorded that it was a widespread belief of antiquarians that the Israelites were mentioned in Homer's epic Iliad as the Ptolemy. Their city of Jerusalem was called Hierosolym, or Jerusalem. On the day of Pentecost, just before the fall of Jerusalem, as the priests in the temple precinct were seeing to their duties, a trembling occurred that shook the temple with a great noise, and the people in and around the temple were terrified at hearing a mighty multitude of voices in the air that said, "Let us remove from here." As the battle raged for the walls of Jerusalem, many people witnessed what appeared to be armies fighting in the sky over the city with fiery weapons, as the temple was illuminated with a strange light, according to Josephus. Interestingly, Tacitus supports Josephus' own account in writing that the temple doors were thrust open and a mighty voice declared a departure. Some reported the air around them mysteriously stirred. The fall of Jerusalem and the emergence of Vespasian and Titus, according to Tacitus, were found in the prophetic books of the temple. When the Romans invaded the temple, there were priests in there waiting, and they had their scrolls open, and they showed Titus and his men where the fall of Jerusalem had been predicted. Josephus reports that 1 million Jews died defending against Rome in the Jewish War, or were executed afterwards, and that 97,000 Jews were captured and sold into slavery. The fields were salted, just as the Romans had done to Carthage in 146 BC. Remember, the Carthaginians were descended from the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians were Israelites. The fields were salted. Okay, I already got that. The Christians at Jerusalem and surrounding lands were the only ones to escape the Romans, for they heeded the warnings of Jesus uttered in Matthew 24 concerning the destruction of the temple after Jerusalem was encompassed with armies. Now, the part that I just read is not in the historical record. This is what Christians write today. But there are no ancient records that say that Christians fled Jerusalem and got away because they heeded Jesus' warnings in Matthew 24 about when the Romans come to destroy Jerusalem. None of that's in the historical record. These things were written 200 and something years later by Roman agents when they put together the New Testament. Remember, it's real easy. It's really easy to make it look like prophecies are being fulfilled when you write a series of documents ex post facto after the events are already over, but you write the events as if the writing itself was composed centuries earlier before those events unfolded. This is how much of the Old Testament was put together. Biblical scholars already know this. It's the general public that hasn't been basically notified about these amazing discoveries and interpolations and these hiatuses in the text that prove these things. So 70 AD, I don't think we're done with 70 AD yet. It is amazing. Okay, I do have a historical note here. Some estimate that in Jerusalem at the attack of the Romans in Jerusalem and the suburbs of Jerusalem were 3 million people. That's a lot. I'm still with you?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so that's a lot. And the reason they believe that there were 3 million people present during the push by the 10th Legion is because the 10th Legion chose to attack during Passover. And you already know all these Jews that live elsewhere come to Jerusalem for the Passover. So the Romans waited for Jerusalem to be packed with people before they attacked, which was actually a genius idea because the city resources would run out much quicker when the 10th Legion got there to reinforce the siege. In the ancient world, armies rarely had to actually climb over the walls and lose a bunch of them. You just camp out for a couple of months and the city starves. All right, so having done all that, we're now going to move on. So we're still in 70 AD. Okay, so all the men who fought defending Jerusalem were executed, crucified, and those surviving this were sent in chains to the arena garrisons throughout the Roman Empire to die violently in the Colosseums by the jaws and claws of vicious animals or in gladiatorial matches where they died at the hands of armored gladiators for the enjoyment of the crowds. Now, you have to understand, guys, remember, the Jews are basically architects of history. This is exactly what we've been told in Fox's Book of Martyrs, which is the only source for all these stories about what happened to the early Christians, because it's not in any historical text from the 1st century AD that Christians suffered any of these things. But when the Christian scriptures were put together and the authority for the New Testament was based off the authority of the Old Testament, giving the Jew more place in the kingdom of God over the Gentile, when all of this was written and put together, it wasn't Christians that were being sold into slavery. It wasn't Christians that were being cast to the lions. It wasn't Christians that were being crucified and hung upside down. No, the Romans were trying to end the race of the Jews. This is the historical record. This is what was happening, and it's not the story that later developed with the writing and the composition and manipulations that went under the church councils putting together the Christian narrative. So, all right, so Jerusalem was torn down with the temple, and its districts were burnt. Roman architects laid waste the city, and then they rebuilt it as a Roman city named Aelia Capitolina. Jerusalem was totally destroyed, then rebuilt as a Roman city named Aelia Capitolina. This is a very important historical fact. We know they rebuilt Petra. We know they rebuilt Baalbek. We know they rebuilt Olympia. We know that the Roman engineers and architects were responsible for much of the great, fantastic architecture of the ancient world. We know in Egypt they went in and rebuilt facades all over Egyptian monuments and temples. And we know that now we know that they rebuilt the Silk Road. The Silk Road was ancient, but the Great Wall of China you see today is actually the Great Wall of Rome. The Romans went in there and built all that. That's why each tower is a Roman mile, 5,000 beads. That's why the width of the Great Wall of China on the top is a road, and it's 16 feet wide, which is standard for all Roman roads throughout the empire. So, for those who are listening to this video and don't know what the hell I'm talking about, and I sound like a maniac, Max Egan and I and Martin Leakey and I did videos on all the evidence that shows that the Great Wall of Rome was a Roman enterprise, and it was the Amazon of the ancient world. And it wasn't that people went and used it as a trade route. That's the falsified version of history. No, merchandise was moved through towers, from tower to tower. At nighttime, they locked it down. That's why it's got crenellations on both sides to protect from bandits and pirates and whatever, because the Great Wall would never serve to defend against armies. It's not for that purpose. It would have never worked. No defending army could have ever used the wall to defend themselves using that wall against an invading army, because they can just relocate their invasion somewhere else. They can just relocate under cover of darkness and hit a different area of the wall. It's ridiculous. It's a road. It was a fortified road where they moved merchandise. And we basically proved it in those videos that the end of the road goes right into the Pacific Ocean, the Yellow Sea. You can see all the ship wharfs and all the docking, all the piers. They're all still there. All still there. That's where major shipping enterprise merchandise was moved from the Orient to the Middle East, and it was moved rapidly. So let's go to, let's see. All right. Now, oh yeah, another reason why Aelia Capitolina is important is because in the historical record, Jerusalem was razed to the ground, and the Romans didn't play. They went in there and destroyed everything. So I'm telling you now that all those places that are marked as tourist attractions in Jerusalem today are lies. They're not true. There's no way. There's been too many resets and breaks and too many different cultures that have been in control over Jerusalem, and Jerusalem has been destroyed too many times. All those places they take tourists to say this is Golgotha, this is it, this is the Temple Mount and all that, it's all a lie. The ruins that are left in Jerusalem are from the Roman period and the Muslim periods. They're not from the original periods. That was destroyed. All that was destroyed. Okay, so Rome began minting special coins with the caption, Judea conquered. These coins have been discovered, showing a sorrowful figure representing Judea. Titus had the temple emptied, taking the valuable temple relics and artifacts recast since 537 BC. All the silver, all the gold, all the temple artifacts and all that was taken from the Jews. Every bit of it. Oh, let's see. We don't need to go through all that. The calendrics were very interesting, though. The calendrics for this year in AD 70. Okay, listen. In the year 713 BC, Jerusalem was surrounded by the Assyrian army of Sennacherib and miraculously delivered, this being 3182 Annus Mundi. This was the year 713 BC. You Archaics veterans know that year is when the sun retrograded 10 degrees and the ancient 360-day year was no more. It was replaced with the modern year of 365.25 days. This was the year 3182 Annus Mundi, 3,182 years since the great Adam and Eve reset that started the pre-flood world. Now, AD 70 is the year 3182 of the Mayan long count. Remember, this is a cross-calendrical parallel. 3182 Annus Mundi, the great timeline we're on now, this is the year 5917 Annus Mundi. But AD 70, when Jerusalem was destroyed, was 3182 Annus Mundi. It was 3182 of the Mayan long count. And 3182 Annus Mundi was when Jerusalem was surrounded by armies and it was delivered and the calendar was changed. And it was a blast from the sky. So as a cross-calendrical parallel, we have on the Mayan calendar the exact same series of events, now involving Jerusalem being surrounded by armies. But this time Jerusalem is destroyed, they're not delivered. Okay, further, in 723 BC, the Assyrians again sieged Israel, armies surrounding Jerusalem. This was Samaria, the capital city. Jerusalem is the capital of Judea. The Assyrians in 723 BC sieged Samaria, the capital of Israel. And this siege was exactly 792 years before the Romans sieged Jerusalem. Again, we have the Nemesis X timing here. The Nemesis X number 792 again appears in this study, in this period of time. It's all very interesting. Now, I've already told you that this year of 70 AD, the fall of Jerusalem, was the 1000th year of the divided kingdom chronology, when Israel and Judah had a civil war and they split 931 BC. 1,000 years later, Judah is destroyed, Jerusalem razed to the ground, and the Jews begin what's called the diaspora, the Great Dispersion. This Great Dispersion is what leads to all the series of events that build up to our modern world today. So, 3 years after Jerusalem is destroyed, there's still Jewish holdouts. Now, the last stronghold is of the Zealots, and it's 960 men, and they commit suicide. They're surrounded by Rome on a real high cliff, like a mountain cliff. The Romans siege their stronghold at Passover. Now check this out, in the Jewish redacted versions, it says rather than having their women raped and sold into slavery, the Jews killed their children, the Jews killed their wives, and then they killed themselves. But this is how serious it was. These were holdouts. The rest of the Jewish people fled. They got the hell out of the Roman provinces. This just wasn't Jerusalem. Jews fled all the Roman provinces. They got the hell out of everywhere because it was an all-out genocide. Yeah, Rome was fed up. Now, in the historical version that's passed down to us, the Jews are victims here. The Romans are the aggressors and all that stuff. But we've seen enough details spread throughout different records. Like I read to you a few of the historians of the day that claim, this isn't what was going on. There was major financial malpractices ongoing, and the Romans were now threatened by just how much of their wealth was being siphoned out of the empire, and they blame the Jews for doing it. So here is 73 AD, the last Jewish stronghold is gone, and now the Jews are 100% in the diaspora, spread wherever they can find refuge. Now, a cross-calendrical parallel here is that this is 2033 before 2106 AD, Armageddon, the return of the chief cornerstone. Maybe that means something, maybe it doesn't, I don't know, but right here in Chronicon, I'm looking at the year 2033 being something very, very terrible for Jerusalem. And we'll get to that in another Chronicon study on the last days. But it's very interesting correlate here. Oh, by the way, that place, I believe, if you look it up, or if you Google it, you're going to find a lot of stuff about it. It's called Masada, Massada. It was the last Jewish stronghold. It's called Masada. Yeah, Massada or Masada. So a lot of time goes by. I'm talking about a lot of time goes by. But the Romans the Romans are guilty of being a little too confident because decades go by. And in those decades, the Jews came back to Jerusalem. Jews came back into the Roman territories, and they came from all over, and it led to a whole nother war. This is the second war of Rome against the Jews. So before we get to that, we have notation in 115 AD I'm going to have to read. Not really sure what happened in 115 AD. Oh, here it is. Small notation. So, in 115 AD, one area of Rome that, Roman provinces that was left to the Jews, where the Romans didn't go in there and just try to exterminate them. Yeah, I guess their policy was, okay, that's cool, they can just stay there. Was Egypt. I'm going to read to you this because this isn't very widely known either about Egypt. Alexandria, Egypt boasted of a huge Jewish population, much of which was resented by the Greeks and the Egyptians, as well as many others. And this Jewish population had grown very rich as tax collectors and enforcers under the Ptolemies, the Egyptian rulers. A Jewish leader named Lucullus led a revolt to protest of the Roman occupation of Palestine. But the uprising is put down violently. This is in the year 115. Where's my phone? This is in the year 115 AD. So it's not long. I mean, it's 45 years. That's not long at all. It's 45 years after the fall of Jerusalem. So 45 years is long enough for people to make a comeback, but a lot of the people who fled Jerusalem ended up in Egypt, and now Egypt is undergoing the same thing. Financial problems, malpractices, and now there's a Jewish revolt in Egypt. So Lucullus claimed to be, get this, Lucullus claimed to be a Messiah. The prosperous Jewish community is then invaded and crushed by Rome. An earthquake occurs late in the year in Syria, and the Christians are officially blamed for the disaster. I don't believe that either, because there's nowhere in the historical record that is that comport. I believe the rewriters of history put the word Christians in there. But the real history is the Jews were blamed for the earthquake. All right, so that was in 115, which follows now is 116 AD. 116 AD. The extermination of the Jews in Alexandria, Egypt is completed, though many escape. Lucullus had proclaimed himself king of the Jews, but he was killed and the Jewish community is destroyed. Emperor Trajan, exasperated by the Jewish uprising spreading throughout the provinces, orders that all Jews in Mesopotamia be killed. You don't hear about that in the historical record. That's a genocide. You have to be a ruler who is finally fed the F up before you order the execution of an entire people, man, woman, and child. You got to be pissed. So Emperor Trajan blames them specifically for all the civil unrest going on throughout Rome. Trajan invades Mesopotamia and defeats the Parthians all the way up to the Persian Gulf. All right, so This is 828 years after the Assyrians under Sennacherib in 713 BC surrounded Jerusalem and carried many people off into captivity into Mesopotamia, though Jerusalem was spared. 828 is a phoenix number. It's two cursed earth periods of 414 years each. 828 is 138 times 6. In 117 AD, 1 year later, Hadrian becomes the emperor of Rome. I have an interesting aside. Hadrian becomes the emperor of Rome. He was born in 76 AD, which was the beginning of the Saka calendar. However, it also syncs with the Mayan long count. However, his reign ended in 138 AD. But the interesting aside about Hadrian, I have a note about Hadrian over here. And of course I would lose it when I need it most. I had put something aside about Hadrian that I saw was interesting. Let me find it real quick. Well, maybe I don't have something about Hadrian. It wasn't about Hadrian's wall. It was about Hadrian. I might not have got to it yet. I'd lose my butt if I didn't crap out of it. Okay. Okay, guys. During Hadrian's reign, sea waves crashed open an ancient tomb of a gigantic man near Rhotium. The kneecaps alone were measured to be the size of large discuses. Hadrian at once ordered the bones to be reburied. This is preserved in the Greek Myths by Robert Graves on page 685. Just an interesting aside. Just an interesting aside, that's all it is. So let's get back to, all right, now we jump some more years into the future. During all this time since 70 AD, Rome has been exterminating the Jews wherever they find them. So, but it's also dealing with a war against the Parthians. So again, Jews from all over the place, where they're from these provinces, find themselves back after 30, 40 years. They're finding themselves back in Jerusalem. They got nowhere else to go. Well, these Roman provinces keep kicking them out, so they get ships, they get on ships, and they end up back in Jerusalem. So this is where the final conflict begins to unfold. And y'all know who Hadrian is from Hadrian's Wall and all that. 132. So again, we have interesting calendrics. The year is 132 AD. You can't make this shit up. 132 is 66 years plus 66 years. 792 months plus 792 months. Again, related to the Nemesis X deal. This is exactly 792 months after the start of the Jewish War in AD 66. Now Simeon Bar Kokhba, whose name means the son of a star, he leads a rebellion in Judea against Rome. All over again. Again, Judea sent shockwaves throughout the far-reaching Roman Empire and threatened Roman stability. As Roman occupation forces and agents kept in check their vast holdings in northern Africa, Egypt, Syria, Asia Minor, Greece, Illyricum, Italy, Sicily, Spain, Gaul, and the German frontiers to the Rhine, as well as much of Britain, all the way to Hadrian's Wall, the tiny Jewish state again exhibited fortitude and a significant military threat. Unlike other nations, the Jews were able to repopulate their little nation after the total destruction of Judea and Jerusalem in the earlier Jewish war, because more Jews lived abroad among other nations and Jewish communities than ever lived in the small geographical confines of Palestine. Also in this year, oh wait a minute. Okay, well I need to I'm going to read that in a minute. This is about China. But this is 132 AD, and again, the Jews start another revolt. And it conforms perfectly to the 792 patterning. But this time, this revolt is the 4,440th year of the Phoenix chronology. Since the Phoenix phenomenon began its 138-year periodicity. This is the year on the Phoenix timeline, 4,440. But on the ancient Israelite timeline, this is the 444th year of the Seleucid calendar. Just crazy. It's just crazy. Now, let's go to... Yeah, that's an Israelite Syrian calendar. Also in this year of 132, Zhang Hing of China invented the first earthquake sensor, a seismograph. This incredible device was about 8 feet high with 8 bronze dragons holding metal balls in their jaws. The device had an internal pendulum connected to the dragon's tails like levers, and when an earthquake occurred, the pendulum would pull and make the dragon drop its ball into a frog's mouth, indicating the direction of the earthquake. It's crazy. That's 2,000 years ago. That's just crazy. So in 133 AD, Hadrian led the invasion of Galilee and then Judea, his second in command being Julius Severus, governor of Britain. The Romans invaded with 60,000 to 80,000 troops, about 9 through 12 legions. The Jewish defenders fought a guerrilla war that taxed the Romans, and the war would continue throughout this year and into the next year. What's really interesting is that this is 1973 years before Armageddon, and we have this war involving Jerusalem and Judea. And if I'm not mistaken, 1973 was a war in our timeline, was it not? Can I get some confirmation here from somebody? 1973. I'm gonna look at that right now. 1973. Was that Yom Kippur War? 1973. Jewish War. This is a cross-calendrical parallel, I believe. There it is. I was right. Yom Kippur War. This is the Jews are at war again. So here's a cross-calendrical parallel. 133 AD is 1973 before Armageddon. 1973 before the 6,000th year since the Adam and Eve reset pole shift caused by Phoenix in 3895 BC. It is 1973 years until 2106 AD, the return of the chief cornerstone. I don't know why her computer keeps coming on like that. It is really distracting. Anyway, let's move on. So that's 133 AD. Now we get to 135 AD. Y'all excuse me for a minute. I have a dog panicking. This is where it gets good, and I'm getting close to the end of my presentation. 135 AD. I have several notes on 135 AD that are all small, but they need to be known. So 135 AD. Let me find these real quick before we continue. Here, I found them. Got them. Got them. All right. The Jewish war against Rome, 135 AD. It was an embarrassment for Rome. Emperor Hadrian's losses of Roman citizen soldiers and foreign auxiliaries was astounding. The actual death tolls were censored after the war in the same fashion modern governments censored casualty rates and death tolls during unpopular wars. At the start of the war, Julius Severus was in Britain, but he was summoned to the Jewish war, and after conscripting more troops with the promises of Roman citizenship, the armies of Rome, according to Cassius Dio, completely destroyed 50 of the most important Jewish strongholds, 985 Jewish villages and towns, and killed in battle 585,000 Jewish men. of the Judaic province in raids and battles, though the death toll far exceeded this due to the ensuing famine, fires, and disease. Cassius Dio asserts that the whole of Judea was now laid waste, for it was an embarrassment to the Roman government that such an insignificant people could have threatened the security of so powerful and widespread. Wait a minute. Very widespread an empire. Hadrian was disgusted with the Jewish people and wanted to forever end their memory. He renamed, check this out, Hadrian renamed Judea Palestine, or Palestina, which is the origin of the name Palestine today. After the fall of Jerusalem, the Rabbi Johann ben Zakkai led Hadrian into the temple site into a deep catacomb underneath the Temple Mount. Hadrian was shown the bones of skeletons of gigantic humans who had stood over 9 feet high. Zakkai informing Hadrian that these were the Amorite giants that the Hebrews had killed long ago in taking this land. So, the priest told Hadrian in showing the bones, he was only proving that it was the will of God that Rome overcame Jerusalem. For had the Jews listened to their prophets and served God, then the whole of Rome's greatness would not have been sufficient to defeat them. We don't know if that actually happened. These are Jewish redacted histories. We don't know. So this is That little Jewish part right there is actually found in Buber's Tanhuma Devarim 7 in Judaism. This is 100% like a Talmudic text. So yeah, it's hard. I don't know. But listen to this. About 265 years later, Augustine of Hippo, who is considered a father of the church and who Christians today lean heavily on in trying to prove the antiquity of the Christian religion. This is 265 years after the fall of Jerusalem in 135 AD. Augustine of Hippo wrote, "The Jewish nation, condemned for unbelief, is rooted out of its own land and dispersed through every region of the world, that it might carry everywhere the sacred scriptures, and that the testimonies of the prophecies by which Christ and the church were foretold might be furnished by our adversaries, so that it could not be thought that these predictions had been forged by us." Do you see what he admitted to here? Rome already knew that the whole world would accuse them of writing these histories ex post facto. So it's like trying to address a problem before it manifests. That was written in the letter to Marcellinus in the Golden Treasury. Yeah, these are patristic sayings. So anyway, this is 135 AD. 135 AD. Jerusalem is absolutely, completely destroyed. It is gone. And again, just like the earlier destruction of Jerusalem, we have another cross-calendrical parallel. Remember, guys, the year 2033. If it's true that 2033 is a cross-calendrical parallel identifying our 2033 as a date when Jerusalem is going to be destroyed, just like it was in the earlier cross-calendrical parallel, look here. 135 AD is exactly 2,033 years after the Babel reset. After the Babel cataclysm, Babylon is destroyed, languages, and there's a great dispersion. There's a huge exodus from Babylonia as people go all over the world because they can't understand each other anymore. And it's 2,033 years exactly before 135 AD. The Babel dispersion is 1899 BC. You can't make this stuff up. In the calendrics, all of this makes perfect sense. What do we gather from this? In the year 2033 Anno Domini of our calendar, These holographic and prophetic foreshadowings basically indicate for us that a major offensive against Jerusalem will be executed in 2033, and it's not going to be good for them at all. This is 7 years before the Phoenix phenomenon, the breaking of the sixth seal. So, okay, we're done with that. 135. So concerning 135 BC, during the second fall of Jerusalem, it is also recorded that a comet appeared in the sky when Jerusalem was destroyed a second time. And according to Seneca, during the reign of Attalus III of Pergamum, a comet appeared of moderate size at first. Then it rose up and spread out and went all the way to the equator, so that its vast extent equaled the region of the sky, which is called the Milky Way. Now, this is Seneca for the year 135 BC, but in the opposite side of the world, in the Chinese Han Shu documents, we find a report of a spectacular comet. The Chinese later writing in another record that the reign changed. That the reign of the emperor had changed due to this comet. Yeah, that's an old Chinese tradition. Anytime that there was a disastrous episode involving something that appeared in the sky, the mandate of heaven changed. And when the mandate of heaven changed, according to Chinese tradition, they had to remove their present emperor and replace him with a new one, or there would be bad mojo throughout the reign. Yeah, that's an old tradition in China. So we have that done. So now we move to 143 AD, which is, we moved to 143 AD. I'm about to tell you what the Jews did once they were left with no other options. Once they had no homeland, they did two things. One of them, they had a very strong base in Persia. They always did. It's unbroken since the Persian occupation of Palestine. So this exilarchy, this central command of the Jewish race in Persia is called the exilarchy, and these are the ones that give out all the commands to the Jews wherever they are throughout the world. And the Jewish temple ties and all that was always sent to Iran. It was sent to Persia. A lot of people don't know this. In ancient times, the Jewish presence was very strong in Iran, in Persia. It was officially called the exilarchy. This is the rulers in exile. So in 143, we have something very interesting develop. This is going to almost close my presentation. In Mackey's Encyclopedia of Freemasonry, there is an illustration showing that the Royal Order of the Freemasons was specifically founded in Palestine by the Jews in the year 4037 Annus Mundi. Remember, the old Masonic records use Annus Mundi dating. So, the Royal Order of the Freemasons was founded in Palestine by Jews in 4037 Annus Mundi. Some think this is 37 AD, but this is misinformation. For 4037 Annus Mundi is 143 Anno Domini. It is 8 years after the fall of Jerusalem to Rome in 135 AD. So, bereft of a central government in Judea, the Jews of the widespread exilarchy created a fraternity by which they could infiltrate and control foreign governments. They needed the order of Freemasonry, which was called something else at the time. They needed this order in order to establish it, using old books and occult stuff, make it all interesting with alchemical documents. And this is why all the alchemical treatises, this is why astrology, alchemy, all the mystic and occult documents from the ancient world Everything is full of Kabbalism. Everything is full of Jewish symbolism, Jewish symbols and text, and every bit of it. Yeah, I have copies of Francis Barrett's occult works. I have Henry Cornelius Agrippa's books. I have the 1801 versions of copies of the Magus by Francis Barrett. Charles Burgoyne's occult literature. And through all this occult and mystical material is Jewish symbols and Jewish letters. The signature of deceit is through all of this stuff. Freemasonry was specific, not just Freemasonry, not just the Freemasons, but the Elks, the Moose, the Independent Order of Foresters. All these different organizations were created specifically so that people who were attending them could participate in non-Jewish activities while they themselves were never detected as being Jews, and they could get in on the secret societies and all the inside government stuff that was going on in Gaul and in France and in Germany and in Switzerland and all throughout the Britain. These secret societies had popped up after the fall of Jerusalem. These secret societies popped up everywhere, and they were funded with Jewish money. And locals were invited to join, not knowing that the chapter heads were Jewish. And they created this whole system. And people love secrecy. They love being a part of a subversive or secret society. And they have all these symbols and all these degrees, the 13 ancient degrees. This is why, even in Freemasonry, the 13 ancient degrees are all straight out the Bible. All of them, all the symbols, all the degrees, everything up to the Royal Arch of Enoch. Every bit of it. The signature of deceit is through all of it. It was created. The whole idea was created after the fall of Jerusalem to help the Jews infiltrate all these cultures because they needed to find safe havens for their people. That's why they did it. I'm not giving them license. I'm not defending them at all. I'm telling you why they did it. But like any other time, we haven't got there yet. We will do it in the future, but you're not going to believe how many European countries made the same conclusion Rome made. Rome was the first. They made the same conclusion Rome made and ended up kicking these people out of their countries. If I told you how many times this has been recorded in European history in the past 18 centuries, it would blow your mind. But we're going to get into that because we're just now starting this study. Because the next time we come back into this topic, I'm going to explain to you how the Muslim world was able to take the Europeans on and infiltrate, because they would have never done it on their own. They had help. And it came specifically through these secret Jewish societies. Yeah, we basically covered it. We covered it right here, introducing. I do have something for 144. Hold on. I do have something for 144 AD. Maybe I missed it. Okay, yeah, this needs to be said right here, guys. It really does. I need to go ahead and address this because a lot of people need to understand 144 AD is a Fibonacci number. 144, 12 times 12. This is a golden proportion number. It's also the exact year. Get this. This is the exact year that Marcion published the first version of the New Testament. Guys, there is nothing in the historical record of the existence of the New Testament until after the second fall of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is destroyed in 135 AD. By 143 AD, the Jews are creating a new secret societies that later become the Freemasons, the Rosicrucians, the Elks, the Moose Lodge, the Lions Club, the Independent Order of Foresters, things like that. Now, these were all stringently, the only ones that they could never infiltrate were the Archer Guilds. The Archer Guilds were always anti-Semitic. So, but anyway, This year of 144 is very important. Very important. We're talking about 9 years after the final fall of Jerusalem is the first hint of the New Testament. It's the Gospel of Marcion. You got to understand how clever this was. The Jews needed a way to manipulate a whole bunch of people, and they needed to be able to conquer people without wars because they're not capable of fighting them. They were spread out, they were thinned out. So we have the Gospel of Marcion found in the possession of a Turkish navigator. Say he composed it. Now, he's a man of Pontus. This is where Mithridates IV was a stringent enemy of Rome, and he was considered a bishop of the church that existed at that time, but it wasn't a Christian church. These people were students of the Gnosis. Mithraism was the religion of the day. Christianity is unmentioned at this time. But he was a well-educated man, and some believe him to be the son of a Briton. Marcion, otherwise known as Marcellus, was actually a Druid at Tongass who influenced the development of the Celtic Church. Some held that he was a Gnostic named Mark, who had taught at the Christian Church of Jerusalem. This is way after the fall of Jerusalem. Whatever the case, in this year of 144 AD, Marcion brought forth to Rome his New Testament books, written in the Greek language. However, we are told that his gospel was originally written in Samaritan, and that the Gospel of Marcion original was rabbinical. We cannot overstate that. This is another layer of the deception of what was going on in that day. The Gospel of Marcion, from which the gospel narratives of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which contain the stories of Jesus, the parables of Jesus, all this right here, the 13 letters of Paul, all these were in the possession of Marcion, delivered to Rome, and it was widely known that they were rabbinical. Rabbis, Jewish. So, Marcion's New Testament consisted of the Gospel and the Apostolicon. These were the only Christian documents existing at the time. Guys, this is important, very important. Marcion claimed that his gospel account came from Paul himself, who was a student of the Gnosis. Remember, the truth according to the New Testament is that Paul was Jewish. Remember that. Paul in the New Testament admitted that he was a Jew. So anyway, this was important to mention because it's right after what I was describing to you. It's right after the creation of the Freemasonry organizations that were created and funded by Jews to infiltrate European society. That's why they were created. Not only were they created for that purpose, but history shows they worked absolutely ingeniously. It was by that system that the Jews were able to conquer the Vatican. That's why the Pope now wears a tiny hat. So, that, I believe, leads me to 161. The final year. Here is the final year I'm going to discuss. It's only one statement. But again, we're going through these things chronologically so you can see the order of events. 161 AD is amazing because it is a council of Christian leaders at Alexandria, Egypt, who assemble and formally pronounce that there was a historical Jesus. Let me repeat that. In the year 161 AD, many years after the fall of Jerusalem, after the introduction of Christian documents to Rome, and after Rome's war against the Jewish people, in 161 AD, there's a church council, the first church council, and they decide that Jesus is a historical figure. Okay, that's 129 years after the supposed crucifixion of Jesus. That's a long period of time for absolutely no historical records to even say anything about this story. Well, we do have historical records about Apollonius of Tyana, born in 2 BC, a miracle worker and wise man. We do have historical records about Yeshua Bar Kokhba, who started a rebellion in Jerusalem. We do have historical records about a man Josephus said that was prophesying about the destruction of Jerusalem 7 years before Jerusalem was destroyed by Rome, and that he pissed off the priests and the Jewish nobility, and he was whipped for it, scourged, and then released back into the public. But he kept doing his ministry. So what I'm saying here is the story that was invented in Rome was put together. All these stories was a story that initially began as an anti-Semitic document, but it was usurped and then used as a control mechanism to infiltrate European society by a people who didn't even believe the very text that they wrote. So this council would not have been required had it been the general widespread belief that Jesus even existed. Don't you understand? What do you need a council for to determine that if something was real or not? By 161 AD, if the story of Jesus is true, like the narratives put out, then it would have been so prolific and widespread that everybody would have been hearing the news. It's called gospel, the good news. Everybody would have been hearing about it. There would have been no question about it. It would just build like a boulder, just get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger going down a mountain. But that's not what we have. What we have is a series of introduced manipulations that finally construct a narrative centuries after the events they depict. That's what we have. Secret societies like the Freemasons were financed and specifically created by the Jews so they could infiltrate and basically overthrow European culture.
Anti-establishment historians tend to be an unpopular lot, and my own works will undoubtedly serve to reinforce this attitude by those who have published garbage adorned as history. It is my intent to make enemies, to topple their cherished pillars, to silence those charlatans who have sold their fictions off as facts. My mission is to educate those willing to know. I have no doubt I will lock horns with many along the way. The materials that I offer in my books are for those who are unafraid of the dark, who want the truth undiluted, direct. The ancient past, behind the scenes happenings throughout all time periods, censored histories, the academic cover-ups, real facts about race, religion, subversive societies, and even predictive systems of analysis by which future events can be known beforehand or uncovered and explained. Archaics is for the public domain to come to a place where they can receive information that has not been diluted. It has not been censored. You're not going to like some of the things you hear. Some of the many videos are going to tick you off. They're disturbing. The core things that we have been taught since we were introduced into this world have to be peeled back layer by layer by layer for us to fully comprehend the absolute medium of deception that we are totally immersed within. Our world is not what you think it is, but it is a beautiful place. It's all a matter of perception. But where we've been in the past in the collective, as a species, as a race, and where we have traveled in the past up until the present, in our personal lives, has everything to do with where we're going. One who is properly informed is not easily deceived. The fact that so much energy has been expended in covering up the truth about our past can only mean that, though we are blind to it, we must be such a threat to our controllers that burying the past was the only recourse they had in maintaining their power. Or, said another way, we are more than we suppose ourselves to be.